Jeremy, our first question for you today is, what are your thoughts on the provenance or chain of custody of the Zimmermann telegram?
Great question. So the telegram did indeed come from the German Foreign Office. That's been authenticated, but it was intercepted by the British. In large part, this is another interesting part of the story. The British had control of most of the telegraph lines under the ocean, under the Atlantic Ocean. So so in that sense, the telegram had to go through British telegraph lines. It was encoded, but the British had decoded. They'd figured out what the German code was. They held it. They sent it to their embassy in Washington, and then they selectively released it. I say this only to try to make this clear for students. It was that they played the role that Russia played with WikiLeaks in the 2016 election. I think we want students to see that the past is different from the present, but that the past echoes in the present, right? So WikiLeaks hacked the emails, shared them with Russia, and then Russia selectively released them in 2016. That's the game the British played as well. And when they selectively released the Zimmermann telegram, of course, they exaggerated it. So did people get an accurate representation of it? No. Was it real? Yes.
Great. Next question from Anthony Gaios. Do you think that the U.S. is on track to return to a stance of neutrality for our foreign policy, given how much time has passed since the World Wars?
A great question, Anthony. I think there are more people who feel that way. There's definitely more anti-internationalist sentiment than there was 20 years ago. I mean, or 30 years ago. When I graduated high school, it was 1989, 1990. I graduated high school in 1990. It was the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and we felt, our vision was triumphant. Everyone was internationalist. You seemed like a troglodyte if you doubted that. And it's a little different today, right, after Afghanistan and Iraq. And so I do think these things go in cycles. And I do think we're a little more skeptical of internationalism today. But I think what World War I proved, and this was one of my points, is that it's very hard to be a country as large as ours in the modern world and not be internationally involved. And we learned that again with this pandemic, as we did in 1919. It's not just that the germs travel across societies. It's also that the whatever we're going to need to save ourselves is international, right? We don't make all the PPE here. And you know what? We never will. We shouldn't, right? It makes sense for people in other countries to make some of it. We are interdependent. The world has always been interdependent, but the 20th and 21st centuries are centuries of deep interdependence. So I'm hoping we'll be less militarily involved in the world, but that doesn't mean we're going to be less involved. I think actually the kinds of involvement we need are what are more difficult: diplomatic involvement, cultural connections. That's all what you're teaching. We're teaching students to be more culturally aware, I think.
Great. Next question. Do you know of any primary sources from soldiers from British colonies like India?
Yes, I do, actually. And so the best way for me to share those with you would be if you want to email me or email Sam and Liz, and I'd be happy to. There are a number of historians who have written about this. There's a whole industry, a whole cottage industry of people writing about Indian soldiers in World War I and British soldiers in India. And I'm sure there is for other societies. So we could certainly help get those sources to you. And I'm sure some are on the web. I don't have the URLs off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to help with that.
Yeah, and we can post those in the Google Classroom as well, Jeremy. If you find them, we can post them there for everybody. Next question, should we teach World War I in isolation from World War II or as deeply connected to World War II?
Great question. I think we should teach it as connected, but I do think we need to be careful. This is why I made the point about the Nazis not starting World War I. Because too many of my students, I know they're not coming from any of your classrooms because you would not teach them this, but they come into my classroom as undergrads and they say, yeah, the problem is all these wars the Germans started. And it's not that Germany is blameless in World War I, but that is a decontextualized understanding. That's thinking about World War II as the same as World War I. Germany had legitimate gripes. It perhaps was too belligerent. And historians will argue who was more to blame. But no one says any one country started World War I, no historian. Whereas World War II, yes, you have to argue that the Nazis and Mussolini in Europe are responsible for the war. So I think we want to see the continuity of the problems of modern warfare, managing politics in Europe, and rivalries from one to the other. And the problem of Germany being, again, too large to be just another state, too small to dominate. But we do not want to see the dynamic of warfare as being the same and responsibility as being the same.
Did World War I create the same sense of national pride that World War II did? I'd imagine not, but I know that Wilson was big on supporting the war effort.
So I didn't have time to talk about this. It's a great question. There was the same effort to build that kind of national pride. One of the first major international and domestic information agencies created was the information agency created during World War I to actually encourage patriotism. And one of the things Woodrow Wilson did is he went to many parts of the South that he came from and got them to see the war as something in their interest by giving them military bases. That's one of the reasons we have so many military bases in the South. People have this false image that Southerners are more militaristic because we have so many more military bases. The reality is actually that was not true. For reasons that should seem obvious to you, there were very few Union bases in the South in the second half of the 19th century. Wilson's policy was to get Southerners to be patriotic supporters of the war by telling them, look, we're going to put bases there. You're going to get benefits from this as a consequence. So yes, there was a buildup of patriotism, and some of it was sincere, but there was also a lot of dissent. And one could have a whole lecture on that, right? I mean, this was a period when you had large numbers of Americans who said, we don't want to be part of this war. Eugene V. Debs, who ran for president and won more than 1 million votes, was actually put in jail for protesting the war. And the FBI was created at the end of World War I as part of the Mitchell-Palmer raids. He was the Attorney General. The FBI was created in part to control dissent at home. What we've seen is communist, pro-communist dissent. Some of it was terroristic, but most of it was anti-war dissent. And the origins of the FBI actually come out of that experience. A young man named J. Edgar Hoover would be instrumental in the creation of that agency at this time.
Next question from Christina Longofono. Do you think it's beneficial to teach personalities in the context of events as big as World War I?
I do. I think personalities and biographies can be really, really helpful because they give students a sense of the complex decision-making. They give students a sense that the world is not really divided between good and evil. There are lots of different people trying to do what they think makes the right sense in their circumstances. If one did this, many historians have, for the leaders of Europe, you would see all of them, none of them were crazies. None of them were Hitlers, maybe Kaiser Wilhelm II. But he wasn't always the decision maker in Germany. Germany had actually a governmental structure. They had a chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg. One would see that people who look irrational from the outside were actually acting for rational reasons. And one of the lessons we're trying to teach students is to appreciate someone else's point of view, not to apologize for it, but to appreciate it, because the only way you can solve a problem is to try to address someone else's point of view, either to give them what they need, to control, to negotiate, whatever it is. And it's one of the things we fail at most as Americans. We barely understand ourselves, and we often don't understand others. So I think biography is a great way, especially at the high school and college level, to get into this for students. And I think for World War I, having them understand some of the biographies of some of the European actors, not just the American actors.
We had a question come in from the chat. Teresa Russo said, I was shocked to see the King Kong propaganda poster. I can imagine it created an outrage in the USA. With that being said, were the British punished in any way for that poster?
No, they pretty much got away with it. They did their propaganda very well. Here's another historical lesson that I've been thinking a lot about. It's hard to punish foreign countries for propaganda in your country. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? It's really hard. This is an old and a new story. The British were able to get away with this because most of the people who were trading with Britain were doing it for profit themselves. They didn't want to stop that, right? Wilson did. There are a number of letters I've read where Wilson is angry at the British for doing this, but they keep doing it. And if you have a free press and a free society, it's hard to stop people from doing that. So I don't think they paid much of a price at all for it.
Next question from Lois James. Was there a voice against the Treaty of Versailles and its blame on Germany for the war?
Yes, there were many voices about that, and this is a really important point. The Treaty of Versailles was not unfair to Germany. The reparations that were demanded from Germany were reparations that would pay for the cost of the war. So France would not come out of the war weaker than Germany, right? Most of the war was fought on the Western Front in France or on the Eastern Front in Russia. The Germans lost, but they actually were less damaged. So reparations were normal. By the way, the reparations the Germans took from Russia were worse than the reparations they had to pay. But what was bad about the Versailles Treaty was that it blamed the Germans exclusively for the war, the war guilt clause, which was written by Robert Lansing and his young nephews, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. They went over as near teenagers, I think they were in their early 20s, and they wrote that clause in the treaty. It was terrible. It had enormous harmful effects because the Germans felt it gave them an argument that they had been treated unfairly. There were many Americans who recognized that, but the majority thought this was a politically convenient thing to do, Wilson included with that. The most eloquent opposition, of course, to the Treaty of Versailles was from John Maynard Keynes, the great economist who wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace. He was wrong in his economic analysis in many ways, but he was right about the perception of unfairness. And here's a point I always try to make to people, historian or not historian. You want a conflict to end with all sides feeling they were treated fairly, even if they were not all equally good. Everyone needs to feel they have a stake in the post-war settlement or the post-negotiation. Negotiations don't work if I win and you lose, because if you feel you lost, you're just going to try to get me back. You have to feel you got something out of it, right? And that was part of the lesson from World War I that Americans took going into World War II, why the end of that war looked so different, I think.
Any tips for getting high school students to understand the significance of Franz Ferdinand's assassination in the starting of World War I?
Yes, it's a great question. And maybe this is where a little biography works. You know, Franz Ferdinand is often treated in textbooks, you know, as this sort of figure who appears to be assassinated. You know, he appears and then he's assassinated, right? What I think is really important for students to understand is that Franz Ferdinand was being groomed by Franz Josef, his father. He was being groomed to be the successor. Franz Josef had been on the throne for more than 40 years, I think. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was this complex multi-ethnic empire. And Franz Ferdinand was seen as the young protege who was going to take over, and he was going to strengthen the empire. All their hopes were in him. And so his assassination was not just an attack on the family, it was an attack on the future of the empire. It was an attack on the future of the empire. It would be like, and again, I don't like to talk about this because you don't want to encourage us, but it would be like someone killing a presidential candidate or a vice presidential candidate in the United States, someone who's being groomed and prepared to take on this role. So it was an attack on the empire, not just on the individual. It's also fascinating, and I'm sure many of you talk about this, how unlucky Franz Ferdinand was. Gavril Princip, the terrorist, who was part of the Black Hand, which is a Serbian terrorist group, who tried to assassinate Franz Ferdinand at the first time, missed. He wasn't in the right place at the right time, and he was walking from the location, and Franz Ferdinand's driver had taken him on the wrong back road, and lo and behold, there was Franz Ferdinand. So this is also a point where contingency really matters.
All right, and I think our last question, which is great because we only have a minute and a half left for Q&A, is how do you teach the Alien and Sedition Acts during this period? Historical connections with War of 1812 or unique for this time?
No, this is a great point. I do a whole lecture on immigration in the early 20th century, which ends with the 1924 Act, which is until recently, one of the harshest immigration restrictions in our history. The 1924 Act actually created the quotas by a different region and really kept out. For instance, my father came as an immigrant in 1965. He could only come in 1965 because that was when we finally repealed the 24 Act with Johnson's 1965 Immigration Act. So what you see in this period is what happened during the War of 1812, a recurrence of nativism, which is always there, during the time of international conflict, and the targeting of not just people who are not in the US, but people who are in the US and look like those that we're at conflict with, even if they have no connection to those societies. So I would connect the anti-immigrant activities of the early 20th century, certainly with what happened in the early 19th century, but also with Japanese internment, for example, right? The Japanese who were interned during World War II, they mostly were Americans. They were not Japanese Americans. They were Americans who happened to be of Japanese descent. And this nativism is deeply built into our society, I think, and it often comes from those who themselves are recent arrivals, who are trying to argue why they belong and others don't. In this period after World War I, there was an association of foreign Slavs and Jews and others with communism, with socialism, and with what was seen as uncivilized behaviors, but there's no evidence that there was any threat to American society from them. The fact that Emma Goldman was deported, one of the great female activists of the early 20th century, one of the great worker activists, is a sign of how far this can go. It's very important for students to recognize that nativism is deeply built into our society. One of the roles, I think, of leaders and educated people is to try to control that and not allow it. And it rears its head during periods of uncertainty, when we feel threatened, when we're fearful. And demagogues have long played to it. Demagogues have long played to it. It's an old recipe.
Great. All right, so it is time for our next section.